Hello, today I'm going to be reading Chapter 5 of Takeout by Margaret Maron. Commodin, Ms. Delvico paused in thought, then finished wiping the ink from her fingertips and handed the cloth back to her companion as Detective Hentz stowed the prints of both women in a file folder. Maddie died from Commodin? It's a blood thinner, her son-in-law said helpfully. Yes, I do know what it is, George. Her tone was impatient. My doctor prescribed it when I got my pacemaker, but it was so tedious to have to keep going for the blood tests every 5 or 6 weeks. Now I take. She snapped her fingers. What is it I take, Orla? Miss Orlano dutifully supplied the name of a nationally advertised drug. That's right. Now I only have to be tested twice a year. How long ago did you stop using it? Sigrid asked. The old woman frowned. 6 months ago? Her companion nodded. In December. I told my doctor I could no longer come to his office so often, and he changed the prescription. Do you still have some of it on hand? Do we, Orla? Miss Orlano's thick eyebrows drew together over the bridge of her nose like two fuzzy gray caterpillars in a staring match. You did not tell me to throw the bottle away. I didn't tell you to keep it either, snapped Miss Delvico. Go get it, please. The woman turned and stumped her way laboriously through the archway to the stairs, where she seated herself in a chair lift that carried her up to the second floor. Edwards watched her go. I thought you were going to get someone to help out, he said. Do you think I haven't tried? She fights me at every turn. Edwards shook his head. I'll ask Laura to reason with her. If she wouldn't listen to Aria, she certainly won't listen to Laura. Who else lives here besides you and Miss Orlano? Asked Sigrid. We've tried to keep live-in help, Edwards answered, but you see the situation. The best we can do is a weekly cleaning service. Miss Delvico gave a wintry smile. Poor George, always having to deal with stubborn women. Yes, Lieutenant, there's only Orla and me in this big house now. And Sal, her son-in-law reminded her. And Sal, she agreed. Sigrid looked up from her notes. Who's Sal? My Albrecht, said Miss Delvico. He lives downstairs in the basement apartment. He shovels the snow, tidies the back garden, keeps the cars running, and does all the heavy lifting Orla can no longer manage, which is why she thinks we can do without someone else underfoot all day. She cast a jaundiced look at her son-in-law. He's also supposed to be our bodyguard. Through the open doors to the central hall, they saw Miss Orlano descend in the electric chairlift, then shuffle back to them, carrying a small orange plastic bottle. Miss Delvico held out her hand, but the other woman shook her head. The bottle's not there. You must have thrown it away. This is your new stuff. Where was the old bottle kept? Asked Sigrid. In the medicine chest in my bathroom, of course. When did you last see it? With a graceful shrug of her thin shoulders, Miss Delvico said, probably the day I took my last dose of it back in December. I thought I put the bottle up on the top shelf when I started taking the new medicine, but I must have thrown it away. Let's go back Tuesday night and your fettuccine. Let's go back to Tuesday night and your fettuccine, said Sigrid. Did someone bring it to you? Or, Sal, said Miss Orlano. I called downstairs and he went around for it. Did he eat any of it? Certainly not. Miss Delvico looked offended at the idea of sharing a dish with a handyman. So only the three of you touched the fettuccine box? Only Sal and me, said the housekeeper. He met me in the kitchen and left the box on the table. I fixed our plates and carried them into the dining room. Of course, thought Sigrid, her face expressionless. No serving herself from a plebeian takeout box in the kitchen for Ms. Delvico. A sense of fairness reminded her that her proper Southern grandmother would never allow a takeout box on her own table either, and she abruptly realized that she was letting her father's death color her objectively. She took a deep breath and kept her voice civil. Does this mean your bodyguard has access to the house and can come and go as he wishes? There are steps from the back of his apartment up to the kitchen, Miss Orlando said. Ms. Delvico's lips curved into a wry smile. A bodyguard is useless if he can't get to you quickly when you need him, Lieutenant. May we assume that there are back stairs from the kitchen to the second floor? You may, but Sal never goes beyond the kitchen unless he is asked to do something. If you're suggesting he went upstairs and rummaged through my medicine cabinet for pills to put in our food, no. George Edwards stirred in his chair. Yes, George, I know it didn't get into the food by itself, but Sal? It really is very unlikely, Lieutenant Harold, he said. Sigrid turned back to the housekeeper. And when you finished eating? I sent her down to that bench with what we hadn't touched, said Miss Delvico. Please let Miss Orlando tell us. I did tell you, the other woman said. Nobody was there, so I left the box on the bench and came back here. We'll need one of your current pills for elimination purposes. Ms. Delvico started to object, then wearily motioned to Miss Orlando, who gave the bottle to Hentz, who tipped a pill into an evidence bag as Sigrid closed her notebook. Where can we find Mr. Elbridge? We'll want his fingerprints too. Miss Orlando looked puzzled. Who? Your bodyguard. Ms. Delvico's laugh held patronizing scorn. Sal? His name is Salvador. Pete Salvador. Sigrid glanced at Hentz, who studiously avoided her eyes and seemed intent on putting away his own notes. George will go with you, said Ms. Delvico. It was a dismissal. And despite Sigrid's attempt at professional objectivity, it felt rather like entitled royalty directing the end of an audience with the peasants. We'll have lunch now, Orla, said Miss Delvico, when they were alone. Is there enough minestrone for George, too? I can stretch it with a salad, replied her companion. I'll get Sal to give us some herbs. She tried not to seem stiff-jointed as she hoisted herself out of the chair and made for the kitchen. There she took the leftover soup from the refrigerator and put the pot on the stove over a low flame, then opened the glass door and stepped out onto the back deck. Sal knelt on a bright green rubber pad to weed a border of trailing thyme. Yeah, he said when she called him in a low voice. We need parsley and thyme and some of those green onion tops, she told him. And the police are coming to ask you questions about Matty. Me? Why? They'll ask you when you saw him last and what he said. So? You haven't seen him in over a week. That's what you tell them. But unless you want me to tell our Signora about how you... He made a short chopping gesture with the side of his hand. Basta, I did not see him, okay? Beanie. He scowled as the side door to the garage opened and hurried back inside before the soup burned. Outside, while Sigrid and waited on the sidewalk, George Edwards walked down the basement steps to the door under the front stoop. When no one answered the bell, he led them to a narrow door beside garage doors that closed off that what was probably once an open alley between 409 and 411. I think it began life as a stable, Edward said as he unlocked the door and gestured them into a space that held two cars end to end. The first was a late model Toyota sedan. At the far end, a heavy canvas tarp covered a longer, bigger automobile and hence lifted a corner to reveal a gleaming chrome grille. Is that an Oldsmobile from the 50s? 1954, Edward said over his shoulder. It was my father-in-law's. A real classic, I'm told. Still run? Oh, yes. Sal drives the girls through Central Park a few times a year. So Benny Olds really did have a thing for Oldsmobiles, Hence said. That's what they say. Before my time, I never met him. At the rear of the garage was a workbench with tools neatly hung on a pegboard. On either side of the workbench were open shelves. The left section held bottles and cans for car maintenance, motor oil, brake fluid, and windshield washer. The right side seemed devoted to gardening supplies, insecticides, and fertilizers. A small electric tiller was tucked under the workbench beside a push mower. Edwards opened a side door, and they stepped into a surprisingly deep, formal garden that reminded Sigurd of British travelogues. A wide curved bed of colorful perennials bloomed along the back and side walls. A clipped boxwood hedge rimmed the back deck, and a tree covered with white blossoms shaded one corner of the deck. The center of the garden had been paved with closely fitted flagstones that held a teak garden bench and an artful koi pond with pink water lilies. Across the garden, a skinny man with stooped shoulders seemed to be in a spirited conversation with Miss Orlando, who had come out onto the rear deck. He wore green coveralls and could not have been more than an inch or two over 5 feet. As soon as the housekeeper saw them, she went back inside, but the man's wrinkled face broke into a smile and he moved briskly towards them, waving his trowel in greeting as he crossed the flagstones and skirted the koi pond. "Hey, Mr. George." His face was creased with wrinkles and tanned from the sun, and his shaggy hair was more white than brown. "Damn shame about Matty, huh?" "Yeah, pretty bad, Sal. I guess Orla told you the police are looking into his death. They want to ask you some questions." "Yeah?" Sigurd introduced herself and hence. "Do you remember when you last saw him?" "I dunno, maybe a week, 10 days. He stopped me a couple of blocks up on 6th. Wanted me to try and get her to forgive him and let him come back. I told him it was never gonna happen." "Her? Ms. Delvicho?" The man nodded. "Forgive him for what?" "For using drugs again." George Edwards answered when the handyman hesitated. "It's okay, Sal. They know." "Yeah," Salvador agreed. She couldn't rely on him no more. Rely on him for what? He didn't show up on time when he was supposed to drive them somewhere. "He drove for Ms. Delvicho, not you?" "I banged up my arm summer before last." He pointed to a climbing rose that covered the garage wall in fragrant white blossoms. "Fell off the ladder, pruning back the Lady Banks roses. Broke my arm in 2 places. Matty needed a job, so she hired him to drive her and the girls when they came into town." "The girls?" "My wife and daughter," Edwards explained. Salvador flexed his right arm vigorously. "It's fine now." "How did you get along with him?" Hence asked. The man shrugged. "Okay. We didn't have much to do with each other. He was good with cars." like to wax 'em, keep them clean. Never put a dent in them anyhow, and he kept the herb beds weeded when he was around. They showed him the key they'd found in Maddie's pocket. Not one of our cars, he said. Are you familiar with Coumadin? Coumadin? Sigurd asked. What's that? An herb? No, it's a blood thinner. Prescribed for a heart condition. Never heard of it, and my heart's just fine. Ms. Orlando said you picked up supper for them. Yeah. We're going to need your fingerprints, Hence said, undoing the clasp on the expansion envelope that held the necessary form and ink pad. Huh? The man drew back defensively. Why? What do you need mine for? It's only for elimination purposes, Hence said. When the man continued to balk, Edwards said, Don't worry, Sal. They don't care about stuff that happened 25 years ago. Hence led the reluctant Salvador over to the bench beside the central fish pond, and Sigurd raised a questioning eyebrow to Edwards, who smiled. He snatched a couple of purses when he was a bicycle messenger. Couldn't resist the temptation when women crossed in front of him, dangling their handbags by the handle. His criminal career was cut short when a woman's husband chased after him. He crashed into a Brett's wagon, and the husband nearly beat him to a pulp. I don't know how they met, but right before he was killed, Benny hired to drive Sophia and Aria, my wife. I guess you know about that? That he was shot down in front of the house? Yes. Aria didn't see it happen, but she was here in the house and ran out to the street when she heard the shots. She was only a teenager. Had nightmares about it for years. Natural, I suppose. Yes, said Sigrid. At least Benny Old's daughter had clear memories of him. She herself could barely remember her own father. According to Mac, Olds had been a loving and a protective father. So yes, seeing his body bloody and torn apart by bullets would surely be the stuff of nightmares. By now, Sam Hence was finished with Salvador, and the two detectives followed George Edwards back through the garage to the street. After Edwards led them to re-enter the house through the front door, Sigurd turned to Hence and said, So who or what was Alberich that so amused you and Miss Salvico? Sorry, Lieutenant. He was the dwarf in Wagner's ring cycle who lived in a cave and stole their ranghold. I'm afraid that Salvador looks a little like the way Alberich is often described, and since he lives in the basement, opera again, I should have known. She glanced at her watch. Well, you wanted to meet her, so let's go see if Charlotte Randolph's remembered anything. And that's the end of Chapter 5, and I will see you again tomorrow for Chapter 6. Have a wonderful day.